The words came out of Cyrus Walden's mouth like gravel dragged across iron, rough and unapologetic, and Beatrice Sawyer did not flinch even once. "This ranch has broken better men than me," he said, standing at the edge of his porch with his jaw set hard as the sun-baked earth beneath his boots, his gray eyes carrying the particular hollowness of a man who had stopped expecting rescue some years ago. "I am telling you that plainly so you do not say later I hid something from you. The land is cruel. The winters are cruel. The work does not stop. And the last 3 people I hired walked off into the desert without so much as a farewell note because they could not take what the Walden Ranch demanded of them. I am not a gentle man, Miss Sawyer. I am not an easy man. And whatever you think you came here to fix, you will not fix it." He was looking at her the way men looked at things they had already decided to dismiss, that flat assessing stare that was supposed to intimidate her, supposed to make her second-guess every mile of the journey she had taken to get here. She had ridden 2 days on a stage from Tucson, then another half-day on the back of a borrowed mule, through dust that got into everything and heat that felt personal in its intensity. She had arrived at the Walden Ranch with her trunk strapped to the side of a hired wagon, her dark hair pinned back, her traveling dress the color of dried sage, and she had looked at this man's hard face and the half-ruined state of his beautiful, stubborn ranch, and she had not once considered turning around. "I did not come to break anyone," Beatrice said. There was a beat of silence between them that had weight to it, the kind of silence that arrives when one person says something true into the space where a lie was expected. Cyrus Walden stared at her. Beatrice Sawyer looked back. And that was how it began, though neither of them understood yet what it was they were beginning. To understand what brought Beatrice Sawyer to the edge of nowhere in the Arizona Territory in the autumn of 1882, you had to understand what she was leaving behind, which was a great deal more complicated than what she was arriving at. She had grown up in Cincinnati, the middle daughter of a schoolteacher father who believed education was the only inheritance worth passing down, and a mother who had taken ill when Beatrice was 12 and never fully recovered. The illness was slow and particular in its cruelty, taking away her mother's strength in stages over many years, and Beatrice had grown up learning to manage a household at the same time she was learning to read Latin and cipher her figures. Her hands knew both the roughness of laundry soap and the smooth spine of a well-worn book. By the time she was 24, she had been engaged twice. The first time to a young lawyer named Harold Fenwick, who had seemed decent enough until he revealed that he expected a wife to be decorative in public and invisible in private, and who had taken the ending of their engagement with a kind of wounded dignity that told Beatrice he had seen her as a possession he was reluctant to lose rather than a person he was reluctant to hurt. The second engagement had lasted only 3 months, to a man named George Alderman, who turned out to have a second woman in Louisville he had forgotten to mention. Both experiences left Beatrice with a clear-eyed assessment of men who presented one face in courtship and another in truth, and a firm belief that she would rather be alone than be deceived. What she had not bargained for was the loneliness that came with the waiting. Cincinnati was a city of social expectations, and an unmarried woman of 25 with strong opinions and no particular fortune was regarded as a problem to be solved rather than a life to be respected. Her father had died the previous spring of a fever that came fast and left nothing behind, and the house they had shared was no longer hers. Her elder sister was married in Philadelphia with 3 children and a husband who was generous but distant, and the younger was still in school. Beatrice had seen the advertisement in the territorial newspaper that a friend had passed along as a joke, though she suspected the friend had passed it along because she thought Beatrice might actually answer it, which she did. Wanted, a capable woman for the position of ranch housekeeper and bookkeeper, Walden Ranch, Calabasas Crossing, Arizona Territory. The work is hard and the location is remote. References required. No complaints about the climate entertained. Apply in writing to see Walden. She had written a letter that was direct and detailed, listing her skills without false modesty and her expectations without false gentleness. She had told him she was educated, capable of managing accounts, capable of managing a household, not afraid of heat or isolation, and that she would require fair pay and her own sleeping quarters. She had received a reply in C. Walden's handwriting, which was angular and spare, like the man himself would prove to be, telling her that she was hired on a trial period of 60 days, during which she would receive room, board, and a wage, and that if the arrangement proved satisfactory to both parties, they would discuss permanent terms. He had not told her the work was hard in the way the advertisement had stated blandly. He had not told her that he would meet her at the edge of his porch and announce his own failure before she had even stepped down from the wagon. But she was here now, and she was not leaving. Calabasas Crossing in 1882 sat in a narrow valley in the Arizona Territory that the mountains on 3 sides had apparently agreed to ignore, leaving it exposed to the full weight of the desert sky and the sun that came down on it without mercy for most of the year. There was a town of sorts, 3 streets wide and 5 streets long, with a general store run by a man named Emilio Vasquez who knew everything that happened within 40 miles and would tell you most of it if you bought something first. There was a small hotel, a livery stable, a post office that also served as the telegraph office, a saloon called the Copper Penny that had seen better decades, and a church that was only open on Sundays when the circuit preacher came through, which was not as frequently as the congregation would have liked. The Walden Ranch sat 6 miles south of town on a stretch of land that had been granted to Cyrus Walden's father back when the territory was still new enough to feel like a promise. It was 1,100 acres of mixed scrubland and valley meadow, with a creek that ran well in spring and went thin in summer but did not dry up entirely, which was more than many could say. There were cattle, not as many as there had once been, and horses, and a bunkhouse that currently held 2 hands named Holt and Devereux, who had been with Walden for 3 years and had apparently developed the particular loyalty of men who had decided that whatever this place was, it was better than whatever they were running from. The main house was something Beatrice assessed in her first hour with a housekeeper's eye and a writer's sensibility, and what she saw was a place that had been built with care a long time ago and had been managed since with functionality but no tenderness. The kitchen was well equipped but disordered. The front room had good furniture buried under dust and a layer of masculine negligence. The curtains at the windows were faded to the color of old bones. There were books on a shelf near the fireplace, which surprised her, and she crossed to them before she had even set down her bag, reading the spines with the automatic hunger of someone for whom books had always been sanctuary. There was a copy of Caesar's Gallic Wars in the original Latin, which surprised her considerably. She heard a sound at the doorway and turned to find Cyrus Walden leaning against the frame, watching her with an expression she could not yet read, though she suspected she would learn to. "Do you read Latin?" she asked without preamble. He looked at the book in her hands. "I did, once." "Who taught you?" "My mother," he said, "before she died." He said it without self-pity, just fact, the way a man states the weather or the time of day. She set the book back on the shelf and turned to look at him directly, which seemed to be something he was not entirely used to, judging by the slight adjustment he made to his posture. "I will need to see the account books," she said, "and the kitchen inventory. I would like to understand the state of the ranch before I start making any changes." "There are not many changes that can make a difference," he said. "We are behind on a note at the bank in Tucson. We lost 40 head to a sickness last spring. The south fence line needs repairing and I do not have the hands to do it." "Then I will look at the books," she said, "and we will see what we have to work with." He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was almost curious, like a man who had expected a different kind of fight and was recalibrating. "Your room is down the hall, first door on the left. Mrs. Holt, the wife of one of my hands, cleaned it last week." "Thank you," Beatrice said. He pushed off the doorframe and left. She stood in the quiet of the front room and looked out the window at the Arizona sky, which was the most extravagant shade of blue she had ever seen in her life, and she thought that whatever this place was, it was not simple. That was all right. She had never much liked simple things. The account books told a story that was common enough in the territory in those years. The story of a man who was working as hard as any man could work and still losing ground to a combination of bad luck, drought, falling cattle prices, and the particular arithmetic of debt that grows faster than honest labor can answer it. Beatrice sat at the kitchen table with the ledger spread before her and the afternoon light coming in at a slant, and she went through every entry for the past 3 years with the focused attention of someone who genuinely believed numbers contained solutions if you were willing to listen to them. Cyrus came in at dusk, his hands dirty from fence work, and he stopped when he saw her still at the table. "You have been at that for 6 hours," he said. "I know," she said, not looking up. "There are some things here I want to ask you about." He washed his hands at the basin, poured himself a cup of the coffee she had made earlier and that had been sitting long enough to become something closer to tar, and came to stand beside her at the table. He smelled of sweat and dust and the particular outdoor smell of a man who spent his days in the elements, not unpleasant, just real. "What things?" he asked. "This payment to a man named Rutherford in February. What was that for?" Something shifted in his face, something she filed away and returned to later. "He was a lawyer," he said. "He handled some business for me." "What business?" "Legal business," he said flatly. She looked up at him. "Mr. Walden, if I am to help you manage these accounts, I need to understand what the money was spent on. I'm not asking to pry into your private life. I am asking so I can do my job." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, setting his coffee cup on the table with a deliberate care, and he looked at her for a long moment. "I had a partner," he said. "For the first 4 years I owned this ranch. A man named Preston Dell. We built the herd together, expanded the grazing lease. 6 years ago he claimed I had cheated him out of his share when I bought him out. He filed suit. The lawsuit went on for 2 years and cost me more than I can easily say." "Did you cheat him?" Beatrice asked. The question landed in the room like a stone in still water. "No," Cyrus said, and the way he said it was not defensive. It was exhausted, the exhaustion of a man who had said the truth so many times to people who kept looking for the lie that he had stopped expecting to be believed. "Then the lawsuit was a form of betrayal," Beatrice said. He looked at her. "Yes." "Did you win it?" "Yes, but winning cost nearly as much as losing would have. And it took 2 years that I should have spent on this place." He paused. "Dell left the territory after. I have not heard from him since." "All right," Beatrice said. She looked back at the ledger and made a note. "That explains the Rutherford payment. It also explains why your herd expansion stopped in 1878. She turned a page. "There is an opportunity here in the horse breeding records. You have a line of stock that has been consistently undervalued. Who buys your horses?" He named a man in Tucson and a ranch in the next county over. "The Army has a remount station outside of Prescott," Beatrice said. "They pay significantly more for sound horses meeting their specifications than a private buyer does. I have read about it. I think your stock might qualify." He stared at her. "How do you know about Army remount stations?" "I read widely," she said simply. "I will write a letter of inquiry tomorrow if you are willing." He was quiet for a moment. "All right," he said. She nodded and went back to her work. He sat there for another 20 minutes, not speaking, just drinking his terrible coffee and watching her go through his accounts with the precise, unsentimental focus of someone who was genuinely trying to understand his situation rather than judge it. He was not used to that. He was not sure what to do with it. What Beatrice came to understand about Cyrus Walden in the first 2 weeks was layered, like the geology of the land he ranched, which presented one face from a distance and another entirely up close. The surface layer was the hard, closed face he showed by default, the flat voice, the economy of words, the way he moved through his own house like a man passing through rather than a man who lived there. He did not make conversation for its own sake. He did not explain himself. He gave instructions and expected them to be carried out, and when they were not carried out correctly, he corrected the error without cruelty but also without excess patience. Below that layer was something more interesting. He was up before the sun every morning, a habit so ingrained it seemed almost biological, and he worked without pause until the light was gone and sometimes after. But he worked with a precision and care that was not merely functional. He knew every one of his horses by name and history, knew which ones had old injuries that needed to be managed, which ones were prone to spooking at particular sounds. She watched him once from the corral fence handle, a young mare that had thrown her rider and was trembling against the fence, and he went to her with a patience that was completely at odds with the face he showed the rest of the world, speaking in a low voice, moving slowly, letting the horse come to him rather than forcing the interaction. He read at night. She came into the front room on the fourth day to retrieve a book she had left on the side table and found him sitting in the chair by the fireplace with the Gallic Wars open in his lap, and he looked up at her with a briefly unguarded expression before the mask came back. "I thought you said you used to read Latin," she said. "I find I still can," he said. "That is the kind of thing one does not really forget," she agreed. He looked at her for a moment. "Did your father teach you or did you teach yourself?" "Both," she said. "He started me. I continued because I liked it." A pause. Something shifted in the room very slightly. "What do you read?" he asked. And that was the first real conversation they had. She told him about her father's library, the mixture of classical texts and scientific pamphlets and novels that had seemed entirely eccentric in Cincinnati and felt entirely natural to her now. She told him about the particular pleasure of reading something in its original language, the way it felt like removing a layer of glass between yourself and the author's actual intent. He listened with the focused attention of a man who did not give his attention carelessly, but was giving it now. He told her in return, and in the sparse way he did most things, that his mother had been the daughter of a schoolteacher in Virginia before she came west with his father, and that she had made it a condition of following him to the territory that the children would be educated, which meant she educated them herself. He had 2 sisters, both gone from the territory now, one in California and one in New Mexico. His mother had died when he was 17. His father had died 3 years ago, leaving him the ranch and the debt. "You have been alone here since then?" Beatrice asked. "I have had hands," he said. "That is not the same thing," she said. He looked at her steadily. "No," he said after a moment. "It is not." She went to bed that night thinking about the particular kind of loneliness that a person builds into their habits over years until they cannot distinguish between choosing to be alone and having made themselves unable to do otherwise. And she thought that Cyrus Walden was perhaps not as impenetrable as he appeared, but that whatever was inside him was guarded by something more complicated than mere stubbornness. The response from the Army remount station came in 3 weeks, which was faster than she had expected. The letter was from a lieutenant named Archer, who expressed interest in seeing the Walden horse stock and indicated that the Army's current contract was expiring, and they were looking for new suppliers meeting specific requirements. He named a price per head that made Beatrice set the letter down and look out the window for a moment before picking it up again and reading it a second time. She found Cyrus in the barn. He was mending a harness with the focused attention he brought to all physical work, and he looked up when she came in. She handed him the letter without speaking. He read it. She watched his face, the slight tightening at the corners of his eyes, the way his jaw shifted. "This price is real," he said. "Lieutenant Archer does not seem like a man who writes fictional prices," she said. He looked at the letter again. She could see him calculating, the way she had already learned to recognize, the internal arithmetic that was always running behind his eyes when something new entered his situation. "If we sold 30 horses at that price," he said slowly, "you would have enough to repair the south fence and make a payment on the bank note that would give you another year of breathing room." she said. "And if we can establish a regular contract, it changes the math considerably." He looked at her, and for a moment his face did something she had not seen it do yet. It opened just slightly, just for a moment, the way a door opens an inch to let in air. "When can he come to look at the stock?" he asked. "I can write back today if you want," she said. "Do that," he said. She turned to go. She had taken 3 steps back toward the barn door when he said, "Beatrice." It was the first time he had used her given name. She turned around. He was looking at her with an expression that seemed to be working against its own instincts. "You did not have to do this," he said. "I did," she said. "It is my job." "It was not in the advertisement," he said. "You advertised for a bookkeeper," she said. "Finding solutions is part of bookkeeping." He held her gaze for a moment longer than necessary, and then he looked back at the harness in his hands. "Thank you," he said, with the particular gravity of a man who does not say those words lightly. She walked back to the house with the desert heat pressing down on her and the sound of the wind in the scrub grass, and she was aware of something she had not been aware of when she arrived, which was that the Walden ranch was beginning to feel like a place she did not want to leave. Lieutenant Archer arrived 2 weeks after her letter, along with a junior officer and a sergeant who had evidently been sent to assess the horses. The visit lasted the better part of a day. Beatrice handled the financial negotiation herself, which initially surprised Archer, who had arrived expecting to deal with Walden directly, and found instead a woman with a ledger and a composed expression who knew the exact quality of each horse in the string, and was prepared to discuss it in terms that the lieutenant could neither dismiss nor argue past. Cyrus stood nearby during most of the negotiation, and when Archer looked to him for confirmation on a point of price, he simply said, "Miss Sawyer handles the accounts," and left it there. By the end of the afternoon, they had a contract for 24 horses at the Army price, with the possibility of additional purchases if the quality proved consistent. Beatrice shook Archer's hand with the straightforward manner that she brought to everything, and the lieutenant rode away looking slightly as if he had not entirely understood what had happened but was satisfied with the outcome. She was writing up the contract details that evening when Cyrus set a glass of cold water beside her on the table, which was such an unexpected small gesture of consideration that she stopped writing for a moment. "You held your ground with him," he said. "He was trying to come down 15% on the price," she said. "That was not a fair reduction. The horses are worth what I said they were worth." "He thought he could talk you down," Cyrus said, "because you are a woman." "He discovered he was mistaken," Beatrice said. "He did," Cyrus agreed, and she thought she heard something in his voice that was not quite amusement but was adjacent to it, something that showed he had been watching the negotiation with something closer to admiration than he would have been comfortable admitting to. October arrived, and with it a change in the weather, the desert heat softening slightly at the edges, the nights dropping to a temperature that required a blanket for the first time since Beatrice had arrived. The work of the ranch continued its relentless pace. She was up early to make coffee and see to the kitchen, then into the accounts for the morning hours, then riding out in the afternoon to make herself useful in ways she had not anticipated when she took the position. She had learned to ride competently enough in Ohio and had refreshed those skills quickly. She helped Holt with the supply inventory, helped Devereaux mend the supply lists, and once assisted Cyrus with a calving that occurred inconveniently at midnight when Devereaux was laid up with a twisted ankle and Holt was away in town. They had stood together in the lamplight of the barn that night, working in a focused collaboration that required no conversation, just the shared language of hands and intention, until the calf was safely born, and the cow was settled, and the crisis was resolved. After, she sat on a hay bale and pulled off her gloves while he checked the calf over one more time, and she was tired in the particular way that good work makes a person tired, pleasantly so. "You are not what I expected," Cyrus said, not looking at her, still attending to the calf. "What did you expect?" she asked. Someone who would last 2 weeks and then complain about the heat and go back to wherever they came from, he said. I told you in my letter that I was not afraid of the work, she said. People say things in letters, he said. They do not always mean them. She thought of the dark past those words carried for him, the way the betrayal of the Dell lawsuit had left him skeptical of stated intentions. She did not push the point. Instead, she said, "What made you decide to answer my letter at all, when you had so little confidence I would last?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because of what you wrote about the accounts," he said. "You described the work accurately, the way a person describes something they have actually done rather than something they imagine. And because you did not ask me anything about the social life of the area or the proximity to town. Every other letter I received asked about those things." "Those things are irrelevant to the work," she said. "Yes," he said. He stood up from the cafe and looked at her in the lamplight, and there was something in his expression that she felt rather than saw, something that landed somewhere in the vicinity of her sternum and stayed there. "But they matter to most people." "I'm not most people," she said quietly. He held her gaze across the warm, hay-scented air of the barn. "No," he said, "you are not." He turned and went to hang the lamp, and she sat for a moment in the near dark, completely still, with the calf breathing softly behind her and the night pressing down on the barn roof and something rearranging itself quietly in the center of her chest. She was not, she told herself firmly, here for that. But she knew, even as she thought it, that the knowing and the feeling were two very different territories, and she had apparently crossed a border she had not noticed. November brought a complication. His name was Garrett Dell, and he was the son of the man who had tried to destroy Cyrus Walden with a false lawsuit 6 years ago. He arrived at the ranch on a Tuesday morning on a good horse, dressed in the clothes of someone who had money or was pretending to, and he asked for Cyrus Walden with the smile of a man who was carrying a hidden motive behind his front teeth. Beatrice was in the front yard when he rode up, and she assessed him before he had finished dismounting. He was perhaps 30, with pleasant enough features arranged in an expression of deliberate friendliness, and he had his father's eyes, which was a thing she deduced only later when Cyrus told her who he was. "Is Mr. Walden available?" he asked. "He is working," she said. "What is your business?" "Personal," he said, which was the answer of someone who did not want to be screened. "Who shall I say is calling?" "Dell," he said. "Garrett Dell." She kept her expression completely neutral. "Wait here," she said. She found Cyrus at the south fence and told him. What happened to his face when she said the name was not anger exactly. It was something more like a man preparing for whether he had hoped not to see but had always known was coming. "What does he want?" he said. "He did not say," she said. "He said it was personal." Cyrus took off his gloves slowly and carefully, a gesture she had come to recognize as the way he organized his composure. "All right," he said. The meeting between them took place in the front room, which Beatrice gave them by going to the kitchen, though the door between the two rooms was not entirely closed, and she heard the shape of the conversation without intending to. She would not have listened deliberately, but the words came through clearly enough. Garrett Dell's position was this. His father had died the previous month in Santa Fe, and in settling the estate he had discovered documentation that complicated the original lawsuit, specifically, documentation that suggested Preston Dell had in fact been fully compensated for his share of the partnership, and had concealed this in his legal complaint. Garrett was not, he said, his father's choices. He had come to say that he understood what had happened, that he was sorry for what his father had done to this ranch and this man, and that he wanted to say it plainly. There was a long silence after that. "Why?" Cyrus said. "Because it was not right," Garrett said. "And because I am trying to be a different kind of man than my father was." Another silence. "I appreciate you coming," Cyrus said, and his voice was careful and flat in the way it got when he was managing something difficult. "I will tell you that the lawsuit cost me considerably, but I did not expect to hear what you just said, so I will take it for what it is." Garrett left an hour later. Beatrice heard him ride away and came back to the front room. Cyrus was standing at the window watching the road. He did not turn when she came in. "You heard," he said. "Some of it," she said. "I am sorry." "It does not change what was lost," he said. "No," she agreed. "But it resolves the secret of it in a way. The story is finished now. There is no longer a hidden truth waiting to contradict what you know." He turned from the window and looked at her. In the slant of the autumn light, his face had a quality she had not seen before, not vulnerable exactly, but opened in a way that felt significant, like a room that had been locked for a long time and was now receiving air. "Beatrice," he said. She waited. He said nothing else for a moment. "Then I am glad you are here." It was simply said, without decoration, and she felt it land exactly where he had aimed it, which was somewhere she had been very carefully not thinking about. "I am glad I am here too," she said, and she meant it entirely. The 60-day trial period ended quietly. Neither of them mentioned it. There was no formal discussion of permanent terms. She stayed. He did not ask her to go. The accounts continued. The Army contract delivered its first payment in December, which was a number that made both of them stand around the kitchen table looking at it in silence for a moment before Beatrice made calculations and showed him how the debt could be managed. He asked her one evening with the directness he brought to most things, "Do you intend to stay? Do you intend to keep me?" she asked. "I asked you first," he said. She looked at him across the table. The fireplace was going, and the room was warm, and the December wind was doing its work outside. And in that moment she thought that this place, this difficult and beautiful and demanding place, had become something she could not imagine leaving. "Yes," she said. "Then stay," he said, "permanently, with proper terms and proper pay." "I will write up the contract myself," she said. "I know you will," he said, and something crossed his face that she had been cataloging since October, that particular thing that happened to his expression when he looked at her, something that was not the closed expression he gave the rest of the world. She wrote up the contract. She left intentional space at the bottom. He signed it without reading it first, which was unlike him, and which told her something. Christmas arrived in the way it arrived in the desert, without snow but with a particular quality of light that turned the scrubland gold in the mornings and cold and silver at night. Holt's wife, a small, energetic woman named Clara who had become a friendly presence, came out to help with a Christmas supper. Devereux had a sister in town who joined them. They sat around the big kitchen table, the 6 of them, and it was the closest thing to a full house the Walden ranch had been in some years. And she watched Cyrus Walden at the head of his table and saw something she had not seen before, which was a man not fighting against his own life but simply living in it. After supper, when the others had gone, he found her at the window looking out at the desert stars, which in the absence of city light were extravagant and nearly aggressive in their brightness. "It is a good sky," he said, coming to stand beside her. "It is an extraordinary sky," she agreed. He was close to her, not touching, but close enough that she was aware of every inch of the distance between them. "I want to say something," he said. She did not turn from the window. "All right. I have been trying to find the right way to say it for some time," he said. "I am not a man who is good with these kinds of things. I want you to know that what I am about to say is not said lightly or carelessly. It has been considered." She turned then and looked at him, because she wanted to see his face when he said whatever he was going to say. His expression was the most open she had ever seen it. The guard was down, not carelessly but deliberately, the way a man lowers his weapon not because there is no longer a threat but because he has decided that what is on the other side of it is worth the risk. "I care for you," he said, "more than I expected to, more than I have cared for anyone in a great many years. I am not asking anything of you that you do not want to give. I am only telling you the truth of it, because I think you are someone who deserves the truth without dressing it up in anything it is not." The desert stars were behind her and the firelight from the room behind him, and they were standing in the world between the two lights, and she felt very clearly and without confusion or alarm that she was entirely in love with this man, that she had been moving toward this feeling since approximately the moment he had looked at her on the porch, and told her the ranch had broken better men than him, and she had told him she had not come to break anyone. "I care for you too," she said. "I have for some time." He looked at her. "How long?" he asked, as if the answer mattered specifically. "Since the night of the calving," she said, "though probably before that if I am honest." Something happened to his face that she suspected very few people had ever been present to see, which was Cyrus Walden showing his joy without restraint, just for a moment before it settled into something quieter and more lasting. He reached out and took her hand carefully, the way he did everything that mattered to him, with full attention and no carelessness. "What do we do with this?" he asked. "What would you like to do with it?" she asked. "I would like," he said, "to court you properly, if you are willing." She felt the smile come to her face before she could consider whether to show it. "Properly," she repeated. "What does that mean to you in practical terms?" "It means I intend to make my intentions clear," he said, "and I intend to conduct myself accordingly." "Your intentions being," she said. He held her gaze steadily. "Marriage," he said. "Eventually, if we arrive at that. I'm not rushing toward it, but I want you to know that is the direction I am facing." Beatrice Sawyer had been engaged twice to men who had spoken of love in poetic terms and meant very little by it. Cyrus Walden was speaking in plain language that contained no poetry at all, and every word of it was true, and she had never in her life been so moved by someone's honesty. "All right," she said. "Court me properly then." He pressed her hand once and released it, and they stood together looking at the desert stars. And outside the wind moved through the scrubland, and the cattle shifted in their pen, and the Walden ranch went about its business under the December sky. January brought hard work, and a harder freeze than the territory usually managed. 3 nights of frost that killed the vegetable patch Beatrice had planted in November, and required everyone on the property to stay up through the coldest hours to keep the young horses moving. She and Cyrus worked side by side through those nights, with the particular wordless coordination they had developed over months, handing each other lanterns and feed and blankets without the necessity of asking. On the 3rd night, when the worst of the cold had passed, and they were both leaning against the corral fence in the gray pre-dawn, too tired to go inside but too relieved to stand at attention, he put his arm around her shoulders, simply, warmly, as if he had been doing it for years, and she leaned into him, and they watched the dawn come up over the eastern ridge in a spectacle of orange and violet that the desert did with a kind of theatrical excess. "We saved them all," she said. "We did," he said. She felt his arm around her and the warmth of his side and the solid reality of him, and she thought that this was what she had always wanted without knowing how to name it. Not poetry and not performing love, but standing inside it like standing inside a house that had been built to last. He walked her back to the house when the sun was fully up. At the door he paused. "Beatrice," he said. She turned. He kissed her, briefly and with great care, and then looked at her with that open expression. "I have been wanting to do that since October," he said. She laughed, which surprised them both. A full and genuine laugh that came from the fact that she had been thinking approximately the same thing and had been slightly more rigorous than him about not admitting it. "I know," she said. "I noticed." "You noticed," he repeated with something that was definitely amusement now. "You are not as impenetrable as you believe yourself to be," she said. He shook his head slowly. "Apparently not," he said. She went inside to sleep for 3 hours. Which was all she had time for before the day's work began again, and she lay in her room with the winter sun coming through the curtain she had replaced in November with something less the color of old bones, and she felt entirely and uncomplicated happy. The spring thaw came early that year and brought with it a second complication, different in character from the first. A man named Avery Coles arrived in Calabasas Crossing in March, with a letter of introduction from the bank in Tucson, and an expression of professional pleasantness that Beatrice recognized as a covering emotion the moment she saw it. He was the bank's representative, sent to assess the ranch's financial position and determine whether the current debt arrangement remained in the bank's interest, which was the polite way of saying he was looking for a reason to call in the note. He arrived with 2 days' notice, and a politeness that did not conceal the threat within it. Beatrice handled the preparation for his visit with the focused energy she brought to genuine crises, which this was. She had the accounts in perfect order, every transaction documented, the Army contract clearly laid out with its payment schedule, the ranch's improved position since the previous year spelled out in figures that were impossible to argue with if you were an honest man. She was not entirely certain Avery Coles was an honest man. He went through the books with her at the kitchen table while Cyrus sat nearby in a silence that she recognized as his particular form of careful watchfulness. And she answered every question Coles put to her with complete accuracy and no added sentiment. When he suggested that the ranch's position was still precarious, she showed him the Army contract and the payment forecast for the next 18 months. When he suggested that the terms of the note might need to be revisited, she produced a letter she had prepared in advance that outlined the relevant territorial banking regulations regarding note revision, which was specific enough that Coles went still for a moment. "You have done your research," he said. "I do my job," she said. He looked at Cyrus. "You are fortunate in your bookkeeper," he said. "I am aware of that," Cyrus said. Coles left the next morning with nothing he had come to find and the note unchanged. Beatrice watched him ride away from the porch and stood there breathing the spring air, which smelled of the first desert blooms and the creek running high from the winter rain. Cyrus came to stand beside her. "He will not be back," she said. "How do you know?" "Because he came here expecting incompetence and he found documentation," she said. "There is nothing for the bank to gain by pushing this ranch now. The numbers say we are viable. As long as the numbers say that, they will leave us alone." He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "Us." She blinked. She had said it without thinking. "The ranch," she said. "You said us," he said. She looked at him. The morning light was on his face and she could see the thing behind his eyes, the question he was not quite asking. "I meant the ranch," she said. "And also I suppose I meant us." "Good," he said quietly. She looked back at the road where Coles had disappeared into the distance, and she felt the shape of the word in the air between them, settled and real and entirely right. April was gentle and persistent, warming the desert floor and bringing color to the scrubland in a way that she had not been here to see before. Small flowers in colors she had no names for blooming in the cracks of the red rock, the creek running bright and clear, the young horses coming into themselves in a way that made her chest expand with something she suspected was pride by association. She had been at the Walden Ranch for 7 months. She and Cyrus had been courting, in his particular definition of the word, which involved many evenings reading together by the fire, discussions that ranged from ranch, accounts to Latin to the territorial politics of Arizona, to the nature of things in general, occasional rides in the early morning when the light was extraordinary and the air was still, and a careful physical proximity that was building with the unhurried patience of both of them. A touch on the arm, a hand held over coffee. Sitting close enough to share warmth without requiring a reason. She had kissed him twice more since January. Both times had been her initiative, which amused her in retrospect and appeared to deeply please him, and both times he had kissed her back with a focused, gentle attention that told her everything about the way he would love a person, which was with full presence and complete honesty. She was writing a letter to her sister in Philadelphia on a warm April evening when he came in from the barn and stood in the doorway of the front room with his hat in his hand, which was the posture he adopted when he was about to say something that had been prepared. She set down her pen and looked at him. "I would like to ask you something," he said. "All right," she said. He came into the room. He sat in the chair across from her rather than beside her, which she suspected was because he wanted to look at her directly and he could not do that if they were side by side. "I know I said I would not rush toward anything," he said, "and I have tried to be honest with that. But I find that I am clearer on this than I expected to be, and I think you are someone who prefers clarity to delay." "I do," she confirmed. "I want to marry you," he said. I want to make this ranch ours in every legal and honest sense. I want to build something here that is not just mine and not just yours, but genuinely shared. I want to grow old beside you, which is the thing I have never wanted to do beside anyone because I had come to believe that the ranch would destroy anyone I tried to bring into it. He paused. I was wrong about that. The ranch did not break you. You straightened it instead. Beatrice sat with his words for a long moment, not because she was uncertain, but because she wanted to honor the weight of them properly. You told me, she said, on the day I arrived that this ranch had broken better men than you. I remember, he said, and I told you I had not come to break anyone. You told me that, he said. What I did not tell you, she said, because I did not know it yet, was what I had come for. She looked at him steadily. I came to find something real. I did not know what shape it would take, but I came because I needed something that was genuine and worth the work. And I found it. I found this place. And I found you. He was looking at her with an expression she had now seen enough times to know it fully, the open face, the unguarded eyes, Cyrus Walden without his armor, which was the most beautiful and most real thing she had ever been trusted with. Is that a yes? He asked. Yes, she said. It is very much a yes. He reached into his breast pocket and brought out a ring, simple gold, a modest stone, and she recognized it with a sudden clarity as something that had belonged to a woman who had taught him Latin when he was young. This was my mother's, he said. If you would rather have something new, I will understand. I would not rather have something new, she said. I would very much like to have this. He came to her and put the ring on her finger with the careful attention of a man who knows what he is doing and means every part of it. They were married on a Saturday in May at the church in Calabasas Crossing, with the circuit preacher performing the ceremony and approximately half the town in attendance, because news traveled at considerable speed in small communities, and Emilio Vasquez, at the general store, had told what seemed like everyone he had encountered in the preceding weeks. Clara Holt cried. Devereux wore a clean shirt that appeared to be slightly too small for him, but that he wore with enormous dignity. Lieutenant Archer had been informed by letter and sent a congratulatory note that arrived the day before. Beatrice wore a dress she had made herself from fabric ordered from Tucson, deep blue, which she had chosen because it was practical enough to wear again and honest enough not to be ostentatious. And because it was, as Cyrus told her when he saw her at the church door in a quiet aside that was meant only for her, the exact color of the desert sky. The ceremony was brief and plain and entirely sincere, and when the preacher asked if Cyrus Walden would take this woman, he said yes with a firmness that left absolutely no ambiguity anywhere in the church. She moved the last of her belongings from the small room to the main bedroom that same afternoon, and they had a supper with the Holts and Devereux that evening that lasted until the fire burned low, and the night that followed was quiet and warm and entirely her own to keep. The summer of their first year of marriage was not simple, because nothing about the Walden Ranch was ever simple, but it was good. They worked together in the full partnership that they had been building since October, the accounts and the horses and the cattle and the fence lines, and the small domestic details that accumulate into a life. And the thing that distinguished it from the previous months was the quality of ease that came between them now, the way that the house felt inhabited by two people rather than one and a half. She taught him to make coffee that was not like tar. He taught her to read a particular stretch of sky that predicted the afternoon storms that came in summer, so she could bring the laundry in before the rain arrived. They argued twice about money, once about the pace of the herd expansion, and once about a proposed expenditure on fence materials, and both arguments were direct and specific and resolved within the day, leaving no residue of resentment, which she considered deeply significant. She wrote long letters to her sister in Philadelphia, letters that described the ranch and the land, and the man she had married with an honesty and affection that her sister apparently read multiple times based on subsequent correspondence. Her sister wrote back with the tentative suggestion that she might visit the following spring, which Beatrice relayed to Cyrus. "She is welcome," he said, without hesitation. "You do not know her," Beatrice said. "She is your sister," he said. "That is enough." By September she was certain she was expecting their first child, which she told him one evening after supper with the particular directness she brought to all important information. He put down his coffee cup and looked at her. "When?" he asked. "Spring," she said. "March or April, I think." He said nothing for a moment. She watched him process the information with his characteristic interior method, the quiet calculation behind the eyes. "Are you well?" he asked. "Entirely," she said. "I feel very well." He reached across the table and took her hand with a grip that was firmer than usual, the pressure of something important being held. "All right," he said. "All right." "You are pleased," she said. "I am terrified," he said. "And pleased in approximately equal measure," she laughed. "That seems like the appropriate response," she said. He stood up and came around the table, and she stood up to meet him, and he held her with a gentleness that was different from all the other kinds of gentleness she had come to know from him, careful and encompassing and fiercely tender. "I will not let anything happen to you," he said against her hair. "Things are always happening to me," she said. "That is generally how I prefer it." He made a sound against her hair that was definitely a laugh, suppressed but real. The autumn progressed, and Beatrice moved through it with the fullness of a life that had finally arranged itself into something that matched its own potential. The army contract renewed for a second year with an increased number. She had begun to teach, informally, on Saturday mornings at the Holt's kitchen table, where two of the children from neighboring properties came to work on their reading and arithmetic, which had grown from a casual offer into something that the parents regarded as genuinely valuable. She enjoyed it with the enthusiasm of someone finding a second vocation. In October, her sister, Alina, arrived from Philadelphia, having made the journey with the determination of someone who had been reading enthusiastic letters for a year and wanted to understand what she had been reading about. Alina was 30 years old, practical in disposition, with the same dark hair as Beatrice and a manner that was more reserved but similarly sharp. She arrived at the ranch exhausted and full of observations, and within a day she and Cyrus had established a wary mutual respect that Beatrice found amusing to observe. "He is very quiet," Alina said to Beatrice one afternoon when they were working together in the kitchen and Cyrus was visible through the window checking the fence near the barn. "He is," Beatrice agreed. "But he looks at you," Alina said. "I beg your pardon. He looks at you the way some men look at land they would die before losing," Alina said. "It is a very particular look. I did not understand it from your letters. I understand it now." Beatrice felt something warm move through her chest. "He does," she said. "Constantly," Alina said. "It is quite something." Alina stayed for 3 weeks and departed with a considerably expanded understanding of the Arizona territory, a sunburn she had not anticipated, and a warmth toward Cyrus that Beatrice suspected had developed around the 3rd day, when he had spent an afternoon showing Alina the horses with a patient detail that was not showy but was genuine, and Alina had come back to the house, saying that she saw why Beatrice had trusted him. The baby arrived in March, which was spring in the desert in the way that spring only partially announces itself and then gets overtaken by early summer very quickly. It was a son. He arrived in the small hours of a Thursday morning, with the assistance of a midwife named Mrs. Fuentes, who drove 6 miles in the dark from Calabasas, crossing without complaint, and who managed the whole matter with a competence that Beatrice found entirely reassuring. Cyrus sat outside the bedroom door for the duration and came in when Mrs. Fuentes called him, and when Beatrice put the baby in his arms, he held his son with the same careful, full-attention manner he brought to everything that mattered to him, and his face was completely unguarded in a way she suspected no one else in the world had ever seen. "He looks like you," he said. "He has your jaw," she said. "Already, poor thing." Cyrus looked at her over the head of their son, and she saw in his face everything he had ever not said about loneliness and hope, and the particular darkness of believing that something good was not available to you, and the way those things had been resolved by something as ordinary and extraordinary as the life they were living. "What shall we name him?" he asked. "I thought Thomas," she said, "after my father." "Thomas Walden," he said, testing it. "If you agree," she said. "Thomas," he said to the baby. The baby made a small sound of possible endorsement. "I agree." Thomas proved to be a child of strong opinions and considerable volume from his first weeks, which they navigated with the practical competence they brought to all challenges, and which deepened the daily intimacy of their life together in the way that shared challenge always does. She nursed him and worked her accounts at the same time. Cyrus, who she would not have predicted had a natural ease with infants, handled the earliest morning hours without complaint when she was exhausted, walking the baby through the front room in the gray pre-dawn while she slept another hour. She discovered this one morning in April when she woke earlier than expected and found them in the front room, Cyrus sitting in the chair by the cold fireplace with Thomas against his chest, both of them asleep. She stood in the doorway for a long moment looking at her husband and her son, and she felt the particular gratitude that arrives not as an emotion but as a physical sensation, something that enters through the ribs and expands. She went back to bed and let them sleep. By Thomas's first summer, the ranch was operating at a level Beatrice had mapped out in the accounts 2 years earlier and had not been entirely certain they would reach. The Army contract was their financial anchor. The cattle had been rebuilt to a herd size that made sense for the available grazing. The fence lines were repaired. The debt at the Tucson bank had been reduced to a number that was manageable rather than threatening, and she was projecting full resolution within 3 years. She added a new entry to the accounts in August, a small school. Not a building yet, that would take more time and a specific plan, but a formal twice-weekly arrangement with 4 children from neighboring properties, an agreement with their parents that included a modest stipend, and the use of the Walden front room during the school hours, with a small blackboard she had ordered from Tucson and chalked with the first lesson, while Thomas slept in a basket nearby. Cyrus came in one afternoon during a lesson and stood at the back of the room with his arms folded and watched her teach, and after the children had gone home he said, "You are very good at that." "Thank you," she said, wiping the blackboard. "You should have a building," he said. She turned to look at him. "I was thinking the same thing," she said. "Eventually." "Not eventually," he said. "I want to build it in the spring before the next winter. If we have the children coming regularly, they should not have to do it in someone's front room." She looked at him steadily. "That will require materials," she said. "The accounts can support it by spring if the Army payment arrives on schedule." "Then plan it," he said. "The way you planned everything else." She planned it. The school took shape on paper through the fall, a simple single-room structure at the edge of the ranch's front property, close enough to the road that children from town could reach it without riding 6 miles, with windows placed to catch the morning light and a pot-bellied stove for the winter months. She corresponded with the Territorial Education Office in Prescott, which had begun encouraging the establishment of subscription schools throughout the territory, and obtained a recognition of the arrangement that formalized her role as the teacher. They broke ground in March, when Thomas was a year old and conducting himself with the energetic purposefulness of a child who had decided that movement was the appropriate response to every situation. Holt and Devereaux helped with the construction, and Emilio Vasquez from the general store contributed materials at his cost, which was a gesture of community investment that touched her deeply, and that she added carefully to the record of things Calabasas Crossing had offered them. The school was finished in May, a clean little building that smelled of fresh wood and possibility. She taught her first official lesson there on a Monday morning with 6 children in attendance, the 4 she had been teaching, and 2 new ones from the other side of the valley. Thomas sat in a basket that had been attached to her chair in an arrangement of questionable engineering but considerable stability, and observed the proceedings with the serious attention of someone making notes. That evening Cyrus stood in the doorway of the new school building with her while the last of the day's light came through the good windows and showed the chalked alphabet on the board and the small desks he had made himself over the winter months in the barn on the evenings when she was writing up the accounts. "This is yours," he said. "Ours," she said. "Everything here is ours." He looked down at her. "Are you content?" he asked. It was not a question he asked often, but when he asked it, it was genuine, not the pleasantry version but the actual inquiry of a man who would act on the answer. She considered it honestly, as she considered all things. The school. The ranch, which was alive and working. The horses moving in the late light in the corral. Thomas, who would be walking any day now and who regarded the horses with the focused interest of someone who had already decided his future. Cyrus, standing beside her with the desert evening settling around them. "Yes," she said, "I am content, more than content." "Good," he said. He put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and they stood in the doorway of the school they had built and watched the Arizona sky do what it always did in the evenings, which was to perform a spectacle of color so excessive and beautiful that it never became ordinary, no matter how many evenings you watched it. 2 years later, Beatrice gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Clara, after the woman who had been their first friend on the ranch, with her middle name being the Latin word for light, which was Cyrus's quiet contribution to the naming discussion, and which Beatrice found precisely right. Clara arrived in November with less drama than Thomas had managed and immediately demonstrated a disposition toward observation rather than volume, lying in her basket and looking at everything with the serious attention of someone filing information for later use. Thomas at 2 was a fully upright, fully mobile, fully opinionated individual who received his sister with the caution of someone encountering a new and unpredictable piece of ranch equipment, and then, after 3 days, simply incorporated her into his existing understanding of the world. The school had grown. There were 11 children now, and Beatrice had written to the Territorial Education Office requesting formal designation as a district school, which would bring additional support and eventually a second teacher. The letter she received back in December told her the request was under consideration, which she translated as likely and began planning for. The ranch in the winter of 1886, 4 years after Beatrice Sawyer had stepped off a borrowed wagon and stood in the Arizona sun, and told a hard-faced man she had not come to break anyone, was a different animal from what she had found. The herd was healthy and well-managed. The Army contract was in its 4th year. The debt was gone, fully resolved in October with a payment that Beatrice had marked in the ledger with a single line underline, her version of celebration. The south fence line, the one Cyrus had told her about in that first bleak accounting of his situation, had been repaired and then extended as the operation grew. The house itself showed 4 years of her attention. The curtains she had replaced and replaced again with progressively more color. The kitchen that was now fully organized and well-stocked. The bookshelves that had doubled from their original contents and now held volumes she had ordered from back east, and books Cyrus had added and books they had been given. A small library that Thomas was already working his way through with a determination that seemed hereditary. She and Cyrus had established, without ever explicitly designing it, a daily rhythm that accommodated the ranch, the school, the children and themselves, and that left them enough of each day to be the people they had become together rather than only the functions they served. They read together in the evenings when the children were asleep. They rode out on Sunday mornings in the early hours when the desert had the particular quality of light that still undid her after 4 years of seeing it. They argued when they disagreed, which was still sometimes, because they were both strong-minded people with formed opinions, and they resolved it every time with the honesty that was the foundational material of everything between them. On an evening in January, when Thomas was sleeping and Clara was sleeping, and the fire was going, and the wind was doing its work outside, and the ranch was quiet and present around them, Cyrus put down his book and looked at her from across the fireplace. "Do you remember what you said to me the first day?" he asked. She looked up from her own reading. "Which part?" she asked. "I said several things." "When I told you the ranch had broken better men than me," he said. She set down her book. "I remember," she said. "I told you I had not come to break anyone." He nodded slowly. "I have thought about that many times," he said. "What do you think about it?" she asked. "I think," he said, "that I told you the ranch was what it was as a kind of warning. What I did not say was that I was also warning you about myself, about what I had become in the years before you arrived. I thought the ranch had made me into something that was not fit for the company of anyone who was not as hard as the land itself." He paused. "I was wrong about that. Or rather, you were the person who showed me I was wrong about it." She looked at him in the firelight, this man who had been alone with his land and his secrets, and his dark past for so long that he had begun to believe solitude was simply the condition of his life rather than a circumstance that could change. This man who had taught himself to expect nothing, and then found that expectations were not the right instrument for measuring what was possible. "You were never broken," she said. "You were just waiting for something worth opening for." He looked at her steadily for a long moment. "Yes," he said, "that is exactly what it was." She stood up from her chair and crossed the room to him and sat beside him on the settee, which was a piece of furniture she had selected from a catalogue the previous year and which was, she had always felt, a clear improvement on the chair that had been there before. He put his arm around her and she leaned against his shoulder. Outside, the wind moved through the scrubland and the horses were quiet in the barn, and the desert stars, invisible now behind the winter clouds, were there nonetheless and would be visible again tomorrow. "I want to tell you something," she said. "All right," he said. "I think there is going to be a third one," she said. He went very still for a moment. "Then when?" "Summer," she said, "I think." He turned to look at her, and his face had the same expression it had carried twice before when she told him this particular news. The mixture of terrified and pleased that she had once told him was the appropriate response, and that she now recognized as one of her favorite things in the world. "Thomas is going to be opinionated about this," he said. "Thomas is opinionated about everything," she said. "He will adapt." "Clara will not care," he said. "Clara does not care about anything she has not decided is worth caring about," she agreed. "She is going to be very interesting." He held her close and she felt his breath slow and settle into the particular rhythm that was his version of peace, the rhythm she had come to know the way you come to know the sound of a familiar room. "This life," he said after a while. "What about it?" she asked. "It is the best possible version of something I had stopped believing in," he said. She reached up and took his hand where it rested on her shoulder. "I know," she said. "I feel that too." The third child, another son, was born in July, and they named him James, after no one in particular, just because the name suited him, and he arrived with Thomas's volume and Clara's watchful eyes, and a disposition that was entirely his own from the first day. The house was full now, fully and gloriously full, and the school was a district school with a formal designation and a second teacher. A young woman named Miss Acaffer, who had come from the East with her teaching certificate and her considerable intelligence, and who was boarding in town and working alongside Beatrice with an energy that made the whole enterprise considerably more possible. Calabasas Crossing had grown in those 4 years. Enough new families and businesses that the 3 streets by 5 streets description was no longer accurate. There was talk of a proper courthouse. The telegraph line had been extended, and the service was more reliable. The railroad was rumored to be considering a spur line through the valley, which Beatrice thought she had feelings about in both directions and had not entirely resolved. The Walden Ranch was part of the valley now in the way that permanent things are part of their landscapes. not separate from the community, but connected to it in dozens of small ways. The school, the horses they sold to neighbors, and the army. The accounts Beatrice sometimes helped neighboring ranchers untangle when they were in difficulty. The Sunday dinners that had become a sometime tradition with the Holts and Devereux, who had built a life in the valley himself, having married a woman from town the previous year. On a morning in October, when Thomas was 5 and starting his formal education in the school his parents had built, and Clara was 3 and conducting herself as a full participant in all ranch business whether invited or not, and James was 3 months old and making his opinions known in the direct manner he favored, Beatrice stood at the kitchen window with her coffee and looked out at the desert morning. Cyrus came in from the early chores and stopped when he saw her standing there. "What are you looking at?" he asked. "Everything," she said. He came to stand beside her and looked out at the same view, the corral and the barn and the scrubland and the mountains on the horizon and the enormous impossible sky above all of it. "We built something here," he said. "We did," she agreed. "Something that will outlast us." He put his coffee cup down on the counter and turned to her, and she turned to him, and they looked at each other in the morning light of the kitchen of the house that was theirs, that had been his and was now theirs in every true sense. "You told me," he said quietly, "that you had not come to break anyone." "I remember," she said. "What I have come to understand," he said, "is that you came to build something instead. That is what you did. You came in and you found what was worth keeping and you made it stronger, and you built things that had not been there before, and you made this place into what I had always meant it to be and could not manage alone." She looked at him, this man who had been so certain of his own limitations that he had announced them to her before she had set foot in his house, this man who had turned out to be made of things she had never expected, the Latin and the patience with horses and the way he woke early and worked faithfully and loved with complete and undivided attention. "You made it possible," she said. "You let me in. That was your part. Without that I could not have built anything here. Letting you in," he said, "is the best decision I have ever made." She reached up and put her hand against his jaw, the familiar roughness of it, the steadiness of him. "We should get breakfast started," she said. "Thomas will be up in 10 minutes and he will want to negotiate about what he eats." "He always wants to negotiate," Cyrus said. "He gets it from somewhere," she said. The smile that crossed his face was full and unguarded and entirely Cyrus, the expression she had spent a year learning and would spend a lifetime being glad she knew. He leaned down and kissed her in the morning light of the kitchen, with the desert outside the window and the children still asleep, and the ranch alive and working and fully theirs. And then they got breakfast started, and Thomas appeared precisely on schedule, and Clara followed him, and James made his opinion of the morning known from his basket, and the Walden Ranch conducted another day of itself in the wide and generous light of the Arizona Territory, which had always been extraordinary, and had become, for these two people in particular, the exact landscape in which the best possible life had grown from honest work and patient love, and the decision, made on a porch in the autumn of 1882, to not look away. There were hard years after and good years and years that were both at once, which is the nature of a life lived fully on difficult land in a time when everything was still being decided. The railroad came through in 1889, which changed the economics of the territory in ways that took some adjustment. The school became a proper schoolhouse with its own board of trustees, and Beatrice served on the first board while continuing to teach, because there were not enough teachers, and she was not willing to stop. Thomas grew into a young man with his father's gray eyes and his mother's manner of going directly at a problem, and his relationship with the horses was exactly what Clara had predicted when he was 2, which was intense and mutual and deeply satisfied. Clara grew into herself as a person who observed everything and concluded precisely, and who announced at 14 that she intended to study medicine, which was a statement that Beatrice took seriously, and Cyrus went quiet about for 3 days, and then came back from with the full force of his support. James was the gentle one, unexpectedly, the child who read everything and asked the most questions and had the widest feeling of the three. There was a fourth child eventually, another son they named William, who arrived in the year that James started school and who immediately established himself as the most sociable of the Walden children, the one who needed people the way others needed air, and who would grow up to be the kind of person around whom things organized themselves. The Walden ranch grew and contracted and grew again in the manner of living things, always responding to the seasons and the economics and the decisions of the people who tended it. The Army contract ended in the early 90s when the cavalry began its long reduction, and Beatrice found other buyers, because that was what she did with obstacles. The cattle side of the operation expanded to compensate. The books always balanced at the end of the year, not always by much, but always, because she would not allow otherwise, and because Cyrus trusted her completely with the numbers and the strategy, while she trusted him completely with the land and the animals and the 10,000 physical decisions that a working ranch requires. On an evening in the last year of the century, they sat on the porch as the sun went down over the mountains, which the Arizona sun did with the same theatrical excellence it had always brought to the performance, and Beatrice had her coffee and Cyrus had his, and the ranch was quiet in the way it got in the evenings. "This has been a good life," she said. "It has," he said. "Better than I imagined when I wrote that letter," she said. "Better than I imagined when I answered it," he said. "I was not imagining much at the time. I had given up imagining." She reached over and took his hand, the familiar weathered hand of a man who had worked this land for 20 years and intended to work it for 20 more. "You told me," she said, smiling slightly, "on the very first day that this ranch had broken better men than you." "I remember," he said, and she could hear the quiet amusement in it, the recognition of how distant that moment was from this one. "You were wrong," she said. "I was wrong about several things that day," he agreed. "But that one in particular," she said. "The ranch did not break you. It never could have. You were already the man you needed to be. You just had not had anyone to be that man for yet." He looked at her in the evening light, and his face had the expression that she had once described to her sister as something she could not adequately put into words, which was still true. It was the expression of a man entirely arrived in his own life. "And you," he said, "you came all that way, from Cincinnati." "I did," she said. "Not to break anyone," he said. "Not to break anyone," she confirmed. He brought her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles with the deliberate care he had always brought to things that mattered, and she sat beside him in the last of the desert light with everything they had built around them, the school and the ranch, and the house full of the evidence of a life lived fully and honestly and in love. And she felt what she had felt for 17 years now, which was the deep and unambiguous satisfaction of someone who had found the exact place and the exact person she was meant for, and had known it and acted on it and never once regretted it. The stars came up as they always did, extravagant and excessive in the way of desert stars, and Cyrus Walden and Beatrice Sawyer Walden sat on their porch and watched the old century give way to the new one, and the ranch breathed around them, and the desert held them, and the life they had made together was complete and whole and entirely, unreservedly theirs.